Species unite.
But what's happening lately is that mink on fur farms have been starting to be infected with H5N1 bird flu. So the World Health Organization is worried that this disease is now changing to better infect mammals. Of course, we are mammals. And of course, if it's on fur farms, there's human mammals on the fur farms who can be infected by the bird flu, just the same way that COVID kept pinging back and forth between animals and fur farms and the humans who work there. And so this is a real concern because 60% mortality rate, I mean, that can wipe out most of humanity.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We have a favor to ask. If you liked today's episode and you have a spare minute, could you please rate and review Species Unite on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts? It really helps people to find the show. This conversation is with Poorva Joshipura. Poorva is the Senior Vice President of International Affairs for PETA, and she recently released her second book. It's called Survival at Stake, and it's about how we treat animals and how that treatment of animals affects us. And unless we change it, our survival as a species is at stake. Hi, Poorva. It's really good to meet you.
Great to meet you too.
I read your book, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into it, let's talk a little bit about you. Will you give a little history on your time at PETA?
I've had a history with PETA since I was about 16 years old. That's when I started volunteering for the organization. Years later, I interned with them, and then I started working with them. I've had something or the other to do with PETA for almost, most of my life. And I've been working with them as a staff member in some capacity for almost the last 25 years. In that time, I have been doing everything from being a campaigner to an investigator. And then later on in my career, I was heading up PETA UK and then heading up PETA India. And now I look after some of their international projects.
It's really cool. I mean, a lot of the work you've done is really, really difficult, but that you've been so up close and like as an investigator and to be able to tell the stories of what's really happening. And then as somebody running the show, you've also can see how everything kind of webs together. And because your book is really about connection in a lot of ways, like how we treat animals is how we treat each other, is how we treat the planet. I constantly am saying that, thinking that, hey, come on, it's all connected. But you've lived the connections. And so that's one of the reasons I think, for me, this book was so powerful.
I think it's so important for us to realize that we are animals. We're made of flesh and bones, just like other animals are. We have feelings just as they do. We make decisions just as they do. And so many of our desires are the same, taking care of our children or striving to have a quality life. And all of these kinds of desires are similar to that of other animals. I start off the book by talking about our fish-like ancestor who we share with other vertebrate animals. And we still to this day, if you look at other animals in the animal kingdom, we share some similar bone structure or so on. And so I start off the book talking about those kinds of biological similarities. And then I talk about other resemblances to animals that scientists now tell us that we have, whether it's to large animals like whales or elephants, or even animals like bees. For instance, scientists now tell us that bees dream, that they seem to suffer something like post-traumatic stress in response to a dangerous situation. They play. Of course, it's not a huge surprise that other animals that we might think are more similar to us have similarities too. Pigs can be taught to play video games. Cows are excellent mothers. Roosters can be very cunning. I gave an example in my first book about how roosters, they do a sort of call and a sort of head movement when they have found a nice tasty treat and they want to call a hen over. But sometimes they do that head movement or they do it fake. They haven't actually found anything. It's just because they want the hen to come over. And so other animals are have as much depth as we do. They're not just cute or cuddly or this or that. They have a variety of emotions and feelings and thoughts, and they can be as clever and cunning as the rest of us. So in establishing these types of similarities, I wanted the readers to feel less surprised that therefore what we do to other animals, of course, also has an effect on us.
You start the book talking about the animals, and then you go into so many zoonotic diseases, from COVID to SARS to HIV, bird flu. And I think what we do as humans, unless you're really like, this is your everyday of your life, right? But so many of us as humans, we compartmentalize. Like there was a point during COVID that the world seemed pretty aware, hey, this was caused by how we treat animals. And then the world forgets that really quickly. I'm not saying everybody, but a great majority of the world. They don't connect like, hey, that was actually SARS too. And that was actually HIV too. Nobody sits there going, all these things were started because of our treatment of animals. You don't have to obviously go through all of them, but talk about some of them and just kind of to put this together like, hey, this is a thing that we should all be very aware of in front of us.
It's a big thing. It's a big thing. I thought it very important to put it together in one place in the book, because sometimes we will be talking about HIV or Ebola, or we'll talk about COVID or something else, but we talk about them sort of in a disjointed manner. But all of these things have a commonality, which is that they are zoonotic diseases, that they came to us from animals. Over the last few decades, the new emerging infectious diseases, about 75% of them are zoonotic. That means that they come from animals, and the frequency of those is increasing. So we have to think about, okay, what's changed then in the last few decades for that to be the case? And what's changed is our increased meddling with nature. Increased meddling with nature in the form of factory farming, or killing wildlife, or creating situations where we're interacting in ways with wildlife that we never did before. For instance, perhaps for capturing animals for the animal experimentation trade, or bulldozing over land in places where wild animals live to make room for animals to be factory farmed or the crops to feed them. So because we are interacting with animals in a way more and more bizarre ways, ways that we wouldn't have had many years ago, we're seeing the effects of that now in the form of these types of things. Bird flu, swine flu, which spreads from factory farming. SARS, you mentioned, COVID is largely thought to have come from a wildlife market. And HIV and Ebola, even though they are thought to have jumped the species barrier many years ago, it's believed that those were from hunting episodes, hunting primates. And the hunting primate still goes on in many parts of Africa. So that may not be the end of the story.
Will you explain for people who don't know the history with HIV and Ebola, like how hunting could cause HIV or Ebola in humans?
I actually learned a lot, even just researching this book. I knew the theories of how, there's two main types of HIV, and HIV-1 and HIV-2, and how they both had come from primates that are traced back to primates, but they're two sort of different incidences. Well, apparently, HIV has crossed over to human beings at least 12 times. So 12 different times that this primate disease really has crossed over to infect human beings. And it just so happened through various circumstances that two of those became prominent. And the reason why it has been traced back to hunting, or likely hunting, that's the theory, is because they are primate diseases. So there's many, many primates in Africa, especially, who have something called SIV. It doesn't even affect many of them because they've had it for a long time. But when it crosses the species barrier or into another primate who's not used to that disease, well, then it does affect us. And that's what happened to human beings. So these different strains of HIV have been traced by scientists back to primates. And because hunting is a common thing, which is done in the parts of Africa where it was traced back to, and hunting primates, that is the most plausible theory as to how human beings managed to get this primate disease. And similar for Ebola. Just in a nutshell, oftentimes in places where they've found Ebola outbreaks in human beings, they've also found, for instance, dead gorillas. And there have been instances where people appear to have gotten sick from having either eaten or interacted with dead gorilla body. And so similarly, the thinking is that the most likely way that initially would have crossed over is by us eating or hunting these gorillas, which, again, is a thing that happens. Many people might be surprised to hear some of this, like who hunts primates, who hunts chimpanzees, who hunts gorillas, but different things happen in different parts of the world. And that is a common thing in certain parts of Africa.
Right.
It's changing because it's, increasingly there's laws and a recognition of this being a dangerous practice.
And I would imagine it's also changing because there's just so many less of them.
Oh yeah, well there's less of them, and a lot of them have succumbed, especially gorillas, to Ebola and that type of thing. And then of course there's climate change and just cutting down all of the forests in which they live. But that also brings us in some ways closer to them. So you'll have markets that are adjacent to the jungles, which sell wild animals for either consumption or the pet trade and so on. There was a lot of attention on these wildlife markets with COVID, but it's certainly not a unique situation to China to have these wildlife markets where animals are sold for meat, for fur, for the pet trade, for traditional medicine, and these types of things. And so it's very important, I think, for us to recognize that this is not some unique thing that can happen only out of China. We may have that impression because SARS came from China and COVID came from China, but the same types of markets exist in many parts of Asia, South America, Africa. There's even, they're called wet markets or live animal markets, even in New York City.
I see them.
Different animals, different species, but dangerous nevertheless, and they exist.
And we have a lot of them. I'm in New York. And there's
a lot of them.
There's a lot of them. And everyone thought during COVID that would be a really big opportune time to, change this. But even in New York, we didn't change anything.
I remember back then, there was all of this movement to shut down these live animal markets, but the focus was kind of all around the world. Shut them down in China, shut them down elsewhere. Well, I definitely think we should always start in our own backyards. Yeah. And New York City has a lot of work to do.
One thing when I was reading your book, I was thinking, wow, if I were somebody like from the future and I was reading this book, I just like, what have we done to ourselves? Like, because it's everything we're doing, right? And it's just so laid out. The fact that we have so many more zoonotic diseases that are kind of knocking on the door right now, and that avian flu is happening. And if it really jumped to humans in a big way, COVID would have looked like a joke.
Completely.
And we're ignoring it.
Bird flu is probably the thing that scares me the most. The climate catastrophe, of course, we are so close to getting to a point of no return, but we might even be risking ourselves to be killed off by bird flu even quicker than being affected by what we're doing to the planet. Because bird flu, we are seeing it now appear all around the world in chicken farms. There's many different types of bird flu, numerous ones of which can infect human beings, especially the H5N1 variety, which is very common. When it infects humans, it has a 60% mortality rate. So the thing is, so far, it hasn't been so good at going from human to human, like how COVID did, obviously very easily. And so in a way, that's really what's been protecting us so far. But what's happening lately is that mink on fur farms have been starting to be infected with H5N1 bird flu. So the World Health Organization is worried that this disease is now changing to better infect mammals. Of course, we are mammals. And of course, if it's on fur farms, there's human mammals on the fur farms who can be infected by the bird flu, just the same way that COVID kept pinging back and forth between animals and fur farms and the humans who work there. And so this is a real concern because 60% mortality rate, that can wipe out most of humanity. And it would be largely because of our addiction to eating chickens or stealing their eggs. And so this is a very serious concern. We've had a lot of warning shots.
And why isn't like the bigger world, like the media, and why aren't we hearing more about how concerning this is?
I think, and this is a guess, of course, but I think it's because it doesn't serve it doesn't suit the meat industry. It doesn't suit the egg industry. It doesn't suit the KFCs of the world or the McDonald's of the world. And there's a lot of these, and it's a very, very powerful set of people who really want to downplay what is happening and how it is a huge public health threat to us. In fact, so much so that at the last COP conference, there was a huge push by the meat industry to try to lobby for the conference to put out messaging that would confuse people, or at least make them question things that, yes, of course, we've been hearing how damaging meat is to the planet, but is it really, that type of thing? And these people are advertisers. The money goes very deep. And so I definitely think it's largely due to that the severity of what we're really facing is it's not something people hear about as much as what they should.
No. And typically, too, I think with the way humans behave, there's not a lot of prevention going on in how we act in the world. We usually react when it's too late or almost too late in situations like that. And not until it's there. And then all of a sudden it's panic. But with something like bird flu, that's like way too late.
It would be an absolute disaster. It's already there in terms of what scientists are saying we need to be really worried about. Swine flu, the first year that was it 2009 that the first major swine flu circulated around the world, it killed up to 575,000 people just in the first year alone that it circulated. And that particular swine flu had its roots on a North Carolina pig farm. So it's not something, this weird thing that only happens in, foreign countries or something like that.
No.
It's very kind of a very real threat to all of us. Because of the way that we're treating animals now. What we're doing to them. So not only are we cramming these animals into such crowded, filthy conditions that are disease prone on factory farms, but because we're then doing that, we're also pumping them full of antibiotics to keep them from dying from the conditions that we put them in. And so on one hand, sure, it may keep a level of sickness at bay. But on the other hand, it creates sickness because it creates an environment in which superbugs are created. So these new, more aggressive forms of disease created out of this overuse of antibiotics. It then also creates a situation where we use more antibiotics in farmed animals than we do in human medicine. Because of this extreme overuse of antibiotics, some of these drugs are like last opportunity drugs, like this is, if this drug doesn't work, you're going to die,
Right.
basically. And these types of very, very important drugs are starting to become either less effective or ineffective. And this extreme overuse of antibiotics in animals all around the world is a huge part to blame in that.
And people are dying now, right? From things that antibiotics would have prevented death from not that long ago.
Completely. Already. Antibiotic resistance is already recognized as a massive, major public health threat that is already impacting people. Now it impacts newborn babies even. And so it's not something that might happen later. It's something that is happening now. It's just something that is likely to get worse.
Right.
Because of it. And, one of the chapters of the book is about tuberculosis. And especially because I focus a lot in India for that chapter, because India is the world's #1 milk producer. Well, there's a lot of bovine tuberculosis in India, and a huge population of people there have tuberculosis. This is significant because people travel. Tuberculosis can be passed on to other people. But what's starting to happen there, because of the antibiotic resistance and because of the massive amounts of antibiotics that are used there in cattle or in chickens and so on, the drugs people need for tuberculosis are starting to not work. They have these very strange, aggressive forms of tuberculosis that have formed there. One type which doesn't respond to most drugs, and another type that doesn't respond to any drugs. And so this is, we can see it in real time.
Yeah.
As far as what we're doing to ourselves because of what we're doing to animals.
It's not just, hey, it's really horrible what we're doing to animals on the planet. It's literally like they hold up the mirror in terms of what's happening to humans because of this. And that's, I think, why my brain kept going, like, if I wasn't in this and I was reading this like from another time or something, it just sounds like insane, but this is all real time right now. It's not what ifs. Right. It's very much, this is where we are already. And I think that is one of the real eye-openers, awakeners in your book.
None of it is a what if, and also, but the good news, I suppose, or what I tried to do in my book is to not leave people thinking, give them a whole bunch of awful facts.
Didn't. Sorry, I didn't mean
and then for them to be like, oh gosh, that was awful. But like, I've tried to help people understand that there's a way out here.
Yeah.
And that people are already doing all sorts of things to give us a way out. For instance, we have people who are trying to wean people off animal-derived foods by providing them delicious options in the form of vegan meats or vegan eggs or vegan dairy, and so on. You have the animal experimentation industry moving away, or scientists moving away from the use of animals, not only because of concern for animals, but because it's more human relevant medicine. And we haven't really gotten into all that in this conversation yet, but it's also because it's increasingly recognized that using animals in laboratories is a public health risk in and of itself.
That is a huge one, because the fact that we're using them and they live torturous lives, and many of them, even though they're not supposed to be, are wild caught. But not that I think it makes that, it's still a monkey's a monkey, but they're wild caught, which means they have diseases. And then, well, you tell the story, you tell it in your book about the truck crash with the monkeys on it, and and what that revealed to people?
So there was a group of 100 monkeys who had come from Mauritius, I think it was now. And they had landed at JFK, and they were on their way to a quarantine facility in some part of the United States. Well, anyway, they didn't get very far because the truck crashed in Pennsylvania. And it was on an icy highway. These are animals who are, of course, from a completely different climate. But the truck just fell open. But there was this massive search for these animals because it was recognized by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention that this is a huge public health risk. The monkeys hadn't even gotten to their quarantine facility. That means they hadn't even been checked properly for diseases, or there had been no time period that had passed to see if these animals are safe or disease-free. There was a woman who didn't realize that they were monkeys. She thought they were cats, and she went up to their crates, and one of them hissed at her, and then she got sick. And that was a very big deal. Turns out that she was okay in the end. But this is exactly the kind of thing. And it's happened time and time again in laboratory settings where it's not only hepatitis and diseases that we know about that we can get from primates, but there have been a number of new diseases that have been discovered in the laboratory setting, wild animal diseases that we didn't know about and that started infecting humans because of our interaction with these animals in a laboratory. Marburg is one of those diseases. It's a type of Ebola, essentially. And that killed a number of people when it was first discovered a few decades ago in a laboratory setting. Monkeypox was first seen in a laboratory. I think that was in a laboratory in Denmark. Thankfully, nobody got sick at that point, but that has, of course, since changed, as we all know. We all know about monkeypox now. There was an incident in Virginia where a bunch of monkeys had been imported from Asia, and they seemed to have some type of fever. Some were dying and that sort of thing. Anyway, that turned out to be an Ebola, which would have been an absolute disaster had it started. It was right in the middle of, near the capital of the country, in an area near a shopping center and everything. It would have been, COVID times 25 at least. I don't know.
Right.
But it would have been awful. But they lucked out. They lucked out because they had never heard. It was a new type of Ebola that they had never heard of before. But it's the one type that doesn't infect human beings or doesn't impact us.
Wow.
And so it was a lucky escape. And it's, this type of thing has happened time and again because of animals in labs.
And we continue to import monkeys for testing. None of this is stopping anything, right? No, this knowledge.
Well, in a way it is, because there are governments and companies that are moving away from the use of animals in laboratories. But this is also a big business. And people, find it a little, they don't necessarily think of it that way initially. But we're talking about the breeders, the importers, the veterinarians, the people who make the feed, the people who make the cages. All of these people have a vested interest in keeping this type of thing going. Even, the experimenters who are getting oftentimes huge grants for really why? I mean, if you really think about it, I describe one set of experiments in my book where the person was studying the effect of being in a laboratory on monkeys. Like, that's what they were studying, even though we can see the effect of laboratories on monkeys because there are monkeys in laboratories. We don't have to put a whole nother set of monkeys in laboratory. And they got funding for this. And well, what happened? Of course, the monkeys became very depressed, self-mutilating, and all the rest of it that we already know that happens in a laboratory setting, where they start going really mad, insane, whirling around in their cages and trying to self-soothe by hurting themselves and that sort of thing. And this has happened for decades, this research.
Yeah.
And yet, we haven't changed anything. The monkeys are still kept in the laboratory in the same way that causes them suffering, as has been found in the research. So a lot of this is like that. I mean, really, when you look at it, you have to question why we're funding something like this. Not everything is about saving lives or, curing some type of disease. Some of it is this kind of curiosity type stuff.
And the curiosity type stuff, that's all bad. But the curiosity type stuff is like the most baffling that it still gets funded in 2024. That is definitely shows you the money machine kind of behind it all, because it's idiotic. I mean, it makes no sense that millions of dollars are given to experimenters to test on like nonsense.
A lot of money goes into this nonsense, but interestingly, PETA had started looking into the background of some of these experimenters and to see if being in a laboratory environment, or choosing to be in a laboratory environment where day in and day out you're hurting somebody else, whether that has an effect on human beings. Like, because there is that recognition now that people who are cruel to animals often move on to human victims. And guess what they found? So many examples of animal experimenters either using the same drugs that they were getting for their experiments and then using it on a human being for a sinister purpose, or ranging from murder to, various types of violent crime. And it can't be a coincidence. There's too many of them.
No, I was so glad you put that in your book, because it's like one more connection of look what we're doing and look what that does to us.
Like, just because you might wear a white lab coat, does that really change what you're fundamentally doing to somebody else who you are aware has feelings and thoughts and who's screaming at you and making very clear that they don't want you to inject them or cut into them, and yet you do? I think, either it attracts certain kinds of people then into those types of profession. That could be one thing. Or it could be through the course of training. You hear so many grad students and so on who don't like this stuff to begin with, but their professors and, the machine tells them, well, you have to do it. I mean, this is the way things are done. And, almost making them feel bad for having feelings for these animals. And so there can be a sort of desensitization that also happens.
Sure.
That allows this. And the same thing with slaughterhouse workers. I mean, slaughterhouse workers are, of course, victims themselves. And, it is such hard work. You're dealing with these heavy animals, this heavy machinery, these sharp objects at high speed. No one really cares about you either. There's lots of injuries at the slaughterhouse. It's terrible. And so what happens is that slaughterhouse workers start taking their frustrations out on the animals who are there, who are already inherently going through a horrible time. But then on top of that, you'll have animals being kicked and hit in the face and all this kind of stuff, extra cruelty that you see. But also, there's been studies that show that, when a slaughterhouse comes to town, well, so does the crime rate go up. Because this frustration, I think, leaks out into other aspects of society. And there's also, I write in my book also about a kind of, it's like post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's the kind where when you inflict cruelty on somebody else and the guilt you feel about that. And so a lot of slaughterhouse workers have talked about feeling like that and being really haunted by what they have had to do. And you remember, I mean, back in COVID times, slaughterhouse workers were dropping dead from COVID. Nobody cared. People just kept forcing them to carry on. And I think it's not just about COVID. That's really how they're treated all around.
I think also when they're working in conditions where violence is so normalized, like your job is to kill, like then violence becomes normalized in your psyche. Yeah. How would it not after a while?
Absolutely. I mean, you would have to justify it to yourself in some kind of way.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that process sometimes leads to other violence.
Yeah. One thing that really made me smile in your book was how you refer to whales as Greta Thunbergs with fins, right? Can we just move backwards for a second to that? Because I knew some about whales, but I didn't know. You taught me a lot in this part. And so will you talk about that?
I learned a lot too. I mean, I knew that whales were important to the planet, but I didn't know quite how much. And
no, me neither.
So I describe them that way because they do a bigger service to the planet than even trees. They have these huge bodies that are carbon stores. And so when they die, they take all of that stored carbon down to the bottom of the ocean instead of it being released into the atmosphere. And it's not only whales, it's really all marine animals. But of course, the bigger they are, the more carbon they store. And so, when you have fisheries, for instance, that are dealing in like big fish like tuna and so on, it's not just about cruelty to that animal. There's a huge amount of carbon that is released into the environment when we bring those fish up out of the sea and when we eat them, even the small fish, but, of course, the bigger fish play a bigger role. And it's, one of the things that I also was struck by when I was doing the research for my book is the biggest threat to whales is not direct hunting of whales, which is what I started off thinking, which I'm sure most people think that is the biggest threat to whales. The biggest threat to whales is bycatch. That means when whales get accidentally caught in nets and fishing gear when we're trying to catch other animals, other target animals who we want to catch. So they say that bycatch is, it's estimated that up to 40% of animals who are caught from fishing are actually bycatch, non-target animals. So it's kind of like you eat one fish and you've technically also killed another seabird or a turtle or some other animal who wasn't meant to be caught. So fishing is the biggest threat to whales. So we can talk about like the Japans and the Icelands and Norways of the world and so on. And we should be having, of course, those conversations. But if we have fish on our plates, we have to do some self-reflection because that is what's really killing the whales. By all means, we need to keep focusing on that. But, it's always easy to focus on someone else doing something. For example, China with COVID or, and not New York City or, that sort of thing. And it's so important for us to realize the connections between what we might be doing and these issues so that we can also make a change in our own lives and our own communities.
One thing I think that's changed, and you probably know this better than I do, but in the past few years, and it hasn't changed quite enough, yet. But the conversation seems to be changing about animal agriculture when people talk about climate. Like they're including it a little bit more now. Like a few years ago, it was barely mentioned. And it feels like it's, more of the conversation, at least.
I hope so. I definitely think that there's a huge push for that to be the case. For instance, just even at the level of, COP menus, including meat, and then people calling them out about that. And so there's been a lot of effort to try to put this on the agenda because, scientists and environmentalists, they can see that, well, if you don't recognize this major contributor to global warming, I mean, we're at a stage where we have to.
Yeah.
We have to recognize it. And, meat, egg, and dairy production, it causes about 1/5 of all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Scientists tell us that by going vegan, we can improve our own carbon footprint by about 73% from food, which makes it the single biggest way that we can make a difference as individuals for the planet. Meat, egg, and dairy production is so resource intensive that it just doesn't make any sense if we're trying to feed all these people now or even in the future. You end up, for meat, eggs, and dairy, we use about 1/3 of the world's freshwater resources already, use about 1/3 of the world's global cropland to feed these animals who are deliberately bred to be killed instead of feeding humans directly. And we already use about, not quite 50%, but almost so, 45% or so of global surface areas now dedicated to animal agriculture. It's mind-blowing, really, when we think about these heavy use of resources, when it would be so much more efficient if we just ate the plants directly instead of channeled them through animals and so on. Because after a huge amount of food, huge amount of water, huge amount of land, and all the rest of it, you ultimately just end up getting a little bit of meat or a few eggs, or, the output is nowhere near compared to what you have to give into it to get that amount.
Yeah, if you go vegan, it's huge in terms of what you're doing to combat all of these things. But what else can people do? Like what? And you end the book with this beautiful chapter rounding up kind of all these things people can do. But will you just kind of give a brief overview of what people can do and how they can help?
The number one thing I tell people when, people ask me, how can I figure out what to do? Or, and I said, well, the easiest thing is for you to think about if you would want that done to you. So would you want to be put in a cage to be used for eggs? Would you want to have your throat slit for leather? Would you want to be locked in a laboratory and have poisons shoved down your throat? I mean, so when we ask ourselves these questions, we can quite easily figure out, in my view, what's the right way to go. Because we should just treat other animals the way we would be okay to be treated ourselves. And in that regard, there's, of course, we talked about one of the most effective things you can do is not eat animals. They say every vegan saves up to about 200 animals a year just by not eating them. It's super easy not to wear animals today, too. PETA has resources on our website called PETA Pro Vegan for companies that use that labeling. But really, you can go almost anywhere these days, read the labels, and pick the fashions that you want that are animal friendly. You can opt to buy non-animal tested cosmetics. Again, PETA has a Beauty Without Bunnies database that people can check. You can, opt to make sure that you don't engage in forms of entertainment that use animals and so on. And then I also provide lots of other ideas about what people can do in their own lives in a way. Like, If they have children, there's humane education programs that they can get into their children's schools, or they can even just do something as simple as make sure that their workplace offers soy milk for people's coffees and teas and that sort of thing. So I give about 10 or 12 categories of ideas that people can do, ranging from easy to more involved, depending on where they're at with this.
After writing all of this, does it, like at the end, because it is, you really do look at humans like we are a disaster when you see all the things we've caused, right? Does it leave you feeling hopeful?
So of course, I believe animals are inherently worthy of respect. That's why I've been working in animal rights for so many years. But we are worthy of respect. The planet is worthy of respect. And I think the first step is always for people to know and to people to understand these links. That's why I wrote the book, to help people understand that animal rights is human rights and animal rights is environmentalism. And these are not distinct kind of things. We are all in this together. And to give people hope and ideas and a way out and kind of a roadmap for what we might want to do about this. Because with so many of the crises I talk about in my book, whether it's the climate catastrophe or even things like bird flu, the threat of bird flu that we talked about, we don't have a huge amount of time to turn things around. So the goal was certainly to give people hope. And I do have hope, because if I didn't have hope, I wouldn't have written the book in a way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sure.
Right. So I see people increasingly understanding these issues, doing something about it. And there just has to be more of us doing that.
Great. Well, Poorva, thank you for this, and thank you for writing the book and putting it in the world and your decades of work fighting for animals. All of it.
Thank you so much for having me.
To learn more about Poorva and Survival at Stake, go to our website, speciesunite.com. While you are there, check out our plant-based starter kit or our plant-powered 30-day challenge. Both are really good ways to start shifting to a diet that is not only kinder to animals, but kinder to ourselves and the planet. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like to support the podcast, we'd greatly appreciate it. Go to our website, speciesunite.com, and click donate. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polke, Sam Kosel, and Anna Kollner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.